So let's begin our journey across the electromagnetic spectrum. Our first stop on the spectrum is radio waves. The radiations with the longest wavelengths and the lowest frequencies. The length of these waves are between 100,000 kilometers and just down to 1 millimeter. The frequencies of radio waves range from 0.03 Hz up to 300 gigahertz. In this lecture, we will focus on the very lowest radio frequencies of the radio spectrum. These are extremely low frequency, ultra low frequency, and very low frequency radiations. For the sake of brevity, let's call these ELF, ULF, and VLF. Today, we will learn about where the sources of these radio waves come from, how they are used, plus a couple of myths surrounding their effects. ELF, ULF, and VLF radiations have frequencies ranging from 0.03 Hz to 30 kilohertz. They also have wavelengths between 10 and 100,000 kilometers. Given their incredible lengths, they interact only with very large structures, such as mountains or even planets. And as you may remember from the last module, radiations of this size interact with matter through reflection, scattering, transmission, and absorption. For example, the diameter of the Earth is just under 13,000 kilometers. This means that radio waves with wavelengths in this range will interact with the Earth. Low-frequency radiations, like radio waves, originate from electrically charged particles and come from both natural and man-made sources. They are produced naturally by lightning or disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field. ELF radiation from lightning can travel all around the world as it bounces back and forth between the Earth's surface and the bottom of the ionosphere. And there is a whole range of fascinating atmospheric phenomena associated with ELF and VLF radiation. For example, when lightning strikes the ground, part of its radiation is launched up into the magnetosphere as a Whistler wave, which then bounces along the Earth's magnetic field lines. The lightning actually produces radiation with a range of frequencies. Since the higher frequencies travel faster, with the right recording equipment, the wave sounds like it is howling. Scientists study Whistler waves and related phenomena in order to predict space weather, which can damage satellites and telecommunication signals. In fact, ELF and VLF waves reflect off the D layer of the ionosphere, which is about 60 to 90 kilometers in altitude. Because of this, the Earth and ionosphere form a kind of waveguide for this radiation, so it travels efficiently all around the world. This has great potential for global communications. However, at the moment, it's still not very practical because you need antennas comparable to the size of the wavelength of ELF waves to produce them, and those wavelengths are hundreds of kilometers long. On the other hand, ELF waves can also penetrate seawater to depths of hundreds of meters, so these waves are commonly used to communicate with submarines at substantial depths. Likewise, as ELF waves also penetrate the ground and are reflected back, they are useful for subterranean mapping and detecting underground structures. So, is long-wave radiation harmful? For the past few decades, there has been much public concern about extremely low-frequency radiation, particularly from power grids and pylons. Apparently, radiation from these sources cause cancer and other serious illnesses. Let's take a moment to break down this misconception, using what we have learned about the sources as well as the research studies conducted regarding them. Now, the first point to consider is that power infrastructures propagate ELF frequencies between 50 and 60 Hz, depending on the country. The electric and magnetic fields involved here produce negligible amounts of radiation. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, it is very difficult to produce ELF radiation you need antennas that are hundreds of kilometers long. Even if power lines did produce much radiation, at the frequencies we are talking about, the wavelengths would be incredibly long. In fact, 5,000 or 6,000 kilometers long. So, ELF waves are not going to interact with anything even vaguely human-sized. And their low frequency means that they would have very low energy. In fact, the World Health Organization concluded that there is no consistent evidence of a relationship between adult exposure and cancer risk. So there is no need to fear ELF or VLF radiation from a pylon. Rather, these power infrastructures create static fields, whose field strength drops off very rapidly with distance. In fact, static ELF, electrical and magnetic fields, are produced anywhere where electricity is generated, distributed, or used. Electric fields are produced by the voltage in current-carrying wires or electrically charged surfaces, whereas magnetic fields are produced by moving charge or electric currents. In fact, a magnetic field encircles a current-carrying wire. So things like electrical generators, power lines, electrical appliances, and radio transmitters all produce ELF, electrical and magnetic fields. These static fields may sometimes have some biological effects if they are strong enough and if you are very close to them for long periods of time. In 2007, the World Health Organization investigated the scientific evidence for the impact on human health of static electric and magnetic fields associated with power infrastructures. They found no evidence for any impact on health of ELF electrical fields. There are some effects from acute exposure to high levels of ELF magnetic fields, since these can induce electric currents and fields in the body and affect the functioning of the nervous system. But by high levels, we mean well above 100 microtesla. Most people would normally never be exposed to such strong fields, and they can certainly not be produced by pylons. To give you an idea, let's look at an example. The strength of an ELF magnetic field directly underneath a high voltage transmission line generally only reaches up to about 5 microtesla. Within about 50 to 100 meters from the line, the magnetic field decreases to levels typically found in houses far away from the power lines. The rare exceptions for acute high-level exposure are certain medical exposures and some specialized occupations. In these cases, it would be important to respect exposure limits. One example is magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, and we will look at this in more detail later on in the course. In general, the levels of exposure to the public from ELF magnetic fields normally range from 0.01 to 0.2 microtesla. Chronic exposure to residential magnetic fields above 0.4 microtesla at 50 to 60 Hz has been associated with a doubled risk of childhood leukemia. This has led the International Agency for Research on Cancer to classify them as possibly carcinogenic to humans. Despite this, there are certain things we must remember. Firstly, a statistical association does not mean that the magnetic fields actually cause the leukemia. Further research is needed on that. Further, there is also no evidence at all that ELF magnetic fields increase the risk of cancer in adults. And finally, to experience constant exposure to magnetic fields this strong, most likely you would have to be living within 50 meters of a high voltage transmission line. So let's recap on what we have learned in today's lecture regarding the lowest radio frequencies in the spectrum. They are called extremely low frequency, ultra low frequency, and very low frequency radiation. We have seen that these radio waves can be produced wherever there are electrically charged particles, most naturally from lightning or geomagnetic phenomena, or artificially from extremely long antennas. There is no evidence whatsoever for ill health effects from these radiations, with the exception of a couple of very specific and rare circumstances. However, these situations are due to static magnetic fields associated with the electricity distribution and not any radiation from it. In the next lecture, we will be exploring some of the higher radio frequencies, including those used in radio transmissions.